Consciente Podcast, episode 192. Cultural worker and climate communicator, Julia Matamoros.
Definitely we need a cultural transformation, and no one's better positioned to contribute to that than the arts and culture. And so I think part of the task that we have ahead is, as artists, as culture makers, is to really question how we got here in the first place. What brought us here? What are the stories we've been told?
Holà. I decided to begin my conversation with the brilliant Mexican-Canadian cultural worker and climate communicator, Julia Matamoros, in Spanish, so that she could introduce herself in her first language. And it worked. Gracias, Julia. Now, I first met Julia in 2022, while I was chair of the board of Scale. And she was the communications lead, and I was impressed by her strategies and insights on how to further engage artists in the climate emergency, for example.
I think it's very difficult to build new worlds if we first don't understand what's wrong with the values we abide to right now. And that on the one hand, and the second is to start imagining new worlds. That is very hard for a lot of us, when you only know one way of existing and relating to other forms of life. It's very difficult to think there could be other ways. But I think arts and culture are perfectly positioned for that, to lead the way for that. Art naturally is a space where where we can break rules, when we can create new ones, where we can question and resignify. I think we need to resignify a lot, and art needs to lead the way there for sure.
And as you can hear, Julia integrates her diverse backgrounds in arts, culture, social work, and community development with the focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and how to address complex and urgent issues like the climate emergency. Julia believes that these areas are interconnected and essential for social transformation, and she talks about her work with the passion and a kind of serenity that is contagious in a good way. Our conversation explored a range of environmental challenges such as water scarcity in her native Mexico, and highlights innovative climate solutions like rainwater harvesting, the permaculture movement, Mexico's recent ban on GMO corn, and energizing artivism, a new project that Julia is involved in that elevates the role of arts in social and environmental activism. Julia also underscores the need for building networks to increase resilience in addressing climate issues, noting that many initiatives lack adequate community building infrastructure. And she explains during our conversation how to address this gap. Now, among other issues, Julia observes a disconnect between climate change understanding and action in the arts and cultural sector, particularly among cultural leadership. And she doesn't hold her punches in her observations of the status quo.
The arts and culture sector cares. People care. There's a lot of things happening. Where I see the gap is not necessarily like in artists, cultural professionals, even organizations. I see it at the leadership level. This has been very shocking to me. Why is that? I've thought about it, and I think one of the reasons could be perhaps that Canada has started experiencing the impacts of climate change more drastically in recent years, whereas, other parts of the world have been experiencing that for a while. So I don't know if, the what has been going on for the last few years, fires, floods, will make it more of like change the perception around it as a real emergency. I don't know. There's reluctance to speak about it as a priority, to talk about it as an emergency, to devote resources to it.
This section of our conversation brought me back to episode 183 about cultural leadership, where we heard from the arts sector how they are exploring many of the root causes of the ecological crisis, which is very important. However, ironically, the arts sector is not yet in climate emergency mode. This is a complex dilemma, but I like the way Julia suggests ways for us to move forward. And I want to thank Julia for her cultural leadership and vision for the role of the arts. Julia wrote this note to me after our conversation, which I think summarizes her concerns and aspirations. Art is always in the business of culture and of cultural transformation. My wish would be for this transformation to become intentional, grounded in understanding of what no longer works and in our shared yearning for new possibilities. I think it's already happening, but not as a common project. Let's make it a common project, everyone together. Hagamos que sea un proyecto común, todos juntos. Hola, Julia.
Hola, Claude, ¿qué tal?
Bienvenida, Julia, al podcast Consciente. Mi español
Muchas
no,
gracias.
sí, mi español no es muy bueno, pero quiero empezar nuestra conversación en este idioma. Antes de pasar al inglés, ¿por qué no empiezas con una introducción en español y luego un breve resumen de tus antecedentes? I practiced that. En inglés. Y luego hablaremos sobre el arte y la crisis ecológica, ¿vale?
Sale, muy bien. Bueno, pues yo me llamo Julia Matamoros. Soy originalmente de México, pero he vivido pues la mayor parte de mi vida, los últimos 25 años en Canadá. Eh, Estudié literatura, filosofía y he trabajado en arte y cultura toda mi vida, básicamente. También desde que era adolescente trabajé en trabajo social. Y en algún momento me di cuenta que podía combinar estos dos trabajos, que no tenían que ser separados. Y desde entonces he buscado la forma de combinarlos lo más posible. Em, sí, he trabajado pues con educación informal, trabajo comunitario, trabajé en museos, en cine, y en algún momento me empecé a enfocar mucho más a temas de racismo, diversidad, inclusión en arte y cultura, y de ahí pues transicioné a trabajo con medio ambiente y arte y cultura. No los veo desconectados y mi propósito es cada vez integrar más todas estas cosas que parece que no están relacionadas, pero que en realidad sí que lo están. Y bueno, y explorar todas las formas posibles en las que arte y cultura pueden mezclarse con transformación social, con transformación cultural.
Yo entiendo assez bien. I tend to speak Spanish with a French accent. Do you mind just doing a summary of that in English?
Sure. So my name is Julia Matamoros. I'm originally from Mexico, but I've lived in Canada for the last 25 years or so, more recently between Mexico and Canada. And I worked in arts and culture for the last 20 years or so. I've also been doing social work, community development since I was a teenager. And at some point, I realized they didn't have to be separate; that I could combine these two interests. And I've tried since to explore different configurations of that as opportunity allows. Yeah, I've worked in formal education, community development. I've worked in museums and film. And at some point, I decided to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Um, and from there on, like I naturally transitioned to climate. Because to me they're not disconnected. Obviously, these are. I'm hoping as much as possible to integrate these different causes in my work. I think they're very connected, and I think the climate arts and climate is all about making connections, which is part of why I enjoy this work.
Well, we met through Scale because you were working then in communications, and we would share also courses and books and podcasts that we're listening to, and excitement about learning. So I know that's a big part of your way of being is immersing yourself in new knowledge and then sharing it. The podcast continues to be about art and the ecological crisis, though I'm coming to the end of season 5. It's July 8th today, and I'm feeling the end of a series of conversations, and the next one's going to be about art in periods of crisis, and I'm starting that research. But let's start at the beginning of your relationship with art. Like where did that come from? Is it from your family, or is it like you talked about it as a through line, I think, in all of these other interconnections? But tell me about your relationship with art, so to speak.
Sure. I mean, art has been part of my life always. Um, I think, for me, it's a necessity. I think for some people, it's just like that. It's a need that I have, and I've always sought it out. And I guess my work in arts and culture started because I wanted to be surrounded by art and culture. Um, and I'm interested in arts and culture broadly, not just like artistic production, but also creative thinking. I studied philosophy, and I mean, there's obviously a very strong connection between philosophy and art. So I think that's where it comes from. I think, well, I started English literature, and I started off really exploring literature and then moved on to film. And then from there on, just like, you know, everything, ceramics, music. Yeah.
And how do the theme of this season is the end of the world as we know it. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, when I looked at your question, I was thinking actually it's just very different. It depends where you are from in the world, and you see that question differently. And um, having spent a lot of time in Mexico over the last 3 years, it's not abstract at all to me. I think the end of the world is happening in many places already, and what's interesting about it is that people experiencing these ends of the world didn't necessarily have time to think about this. They're just responding in the ways they can. So here in Mexico, I've seen a lot of that. There's a lot of water scarcity issues, and but also a lot of really resourceful responses around it through rainwater harvesting, and that might be organized or might be just people developing their own systems at home. The permaculture movement is growing really quickly too, as people see their land is not fertile anymore. Um, Even like Mexico just banned GMO corn recently. So yeah, I think the end of the world is happening. There's a lot of responses going on in very creative ways. Um, and and yeah, I'm not sure. Like, do you want me to talk about it from a Canadian perspective as well, or?
Whatever perspective you want. I mean, the projects that are involved in are also of interest to me. What you're doing in your personal and professional life to address or to look at to use art in relationship to the
Sure.
ecological crisis. I'd be interested in examples. But the Mexican point of view, I think, I take your point that we're depending on where you are in the world and depending how you define your world, right? Because we're not talking just about the Western world, we're talking about whatever world is around you. Sometimes that change can be not necessarily positive, but necessary, right? We need to move out of this mad world into a more sane world. So
Yeah.
I pose the question very broadly because I realize that it really depends on context. But yeah, maybe talk to me about some of the projects you're working on and that'll give us an
Sure.
idea of what's concretely happening.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, you were asking me earlier about my relationship to art, and my relationship to art started off just because I value art. I think it's valuable in and of its own. But I think as find ourselves in this situation, we're like in trouble. We have obviously the climate emergency, the biodiversity crisis, increasing polarization, increasing inequality. So these types of challenges um, require a new level of participation that we've never seen before, mass unprecedented participation. And I think it's just going to be impossible to do anything about them unless everyone becomes involved. And I think that includes the arts and culture with its unique contributions. Um, and I say this just because I don't mean to say, the arts and culture solely need to like um, become involved. I think everyone does, but obviously the arts and culture have unique things to bring to the table. And I'm always exploring that. It's like, I'm drawn to this intersection because it's so fertile. And one of the things I where I see a need and where I can help is helping the sector become involved. And by that I mean, artists, but also cultural institutions, cultural professionals. Um, Depending who you're speaking about, there's different contributions each one brings to the table, but also what they need. Like what do we need as a sector to um, to make a contribution? So trying to understand what's needed and providing that. Um, I'm also interested in exploring the ways in which artistic work and artistic or creative practice can apply outside of arts and culture to solve problems. I think it's all about also bringing our its traditional spaces to help other work that's happening that maybe is not being as effective as we need it to be. Activism, environmentalism. Um, yeah, there's many ways really. I think it's ongoing. I find there's a place where I can help and I become involved. So as you know, I work with Scale for the last year and a half, helping build a network across Canada to bring together the art sector for climate action. And recently, I've also been involved with a project called 23 Climate Things, a collective, and doing some research for that. I've done some strategic clarity and impact coaching, which I think is like so necessary. You know, as a sector, it's important that we understand where we can work together to have real impact, as opposed to everyone working in isolation, doing different things. And more recently, I became involved with a new project called Energizing Artivism, which is all about um, uplifting the role of arts and culture in solving a bunch of the problems we're facing right now. Yeah.
Well, they're all so interesting. That last one, energizing artivism. Can you give an example of what people are doing or what role you play? That sounds
It's
fascinating.
very new, so the idea is really to work with a culture of emergence. So there's no predefined agenda. Like the group is coming together, and we're trying to figure out like what exactly is it that we want to do. But we know there's a need. Like definitely, the arts, as we know, can play a huge role in all these different struggles, environmental and social, but there's not enough support for them. So how can we raise the profile of the arts, and the role it can play, like really recognize its place, and then find the resources we need. And so all I can say about that right now, because it's just starting, is that the inaugural Artivism conference is happening in South Africa in September, and I can share the information for that, and everyone is welcome to attend, to get involved, and I will share some links with you if you want to share that.
Well, it's emergent, and that's an interesting point in the beginning, because you see a need and you use the term need, and I appreciate that you've been helping other artists connect and find resources across the arts and into other sectors, and those challenges have always been there, in cross-sectoral work in art and science and art and health. When I worked at the Canada Council, it was an ongoing methodological problem. But now we're in a crisis, and it's going to become, unfortunately, a permanent crisis. So I'm thinking about how can the arts reinvent themselves. Like they're really good because they tell us stories and they help us with our sorrows and they uplift our spirits. But and we don't want to put more pressure on the back of artists. They're having a hard time right now. But how can we help them? We, all of us, help each other play even a more relevant role, be more integrated into societal systems so that we can really have more impact. So I guess my question is, I'm really interested in this notion of need. How do we provide? How do we answer to need? And also, how can we better be more and more impactful? Because that's also an area of specialization of yours.
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things I do consistently is help build networks. I really believe networks are a huge part of building resilience. I mean, the crisis is unfolding. We don't need to wait for crisis to realize we need networks, but you build resilience continuously, and networks are really important. So, that I've done and I continue to do, and by that I mean connecting separate efforts, providing resources, information, so they're readily available for people when they want to get involved, facilitating collaborations, because I think, it's often when we speak of the climate emergency, we talk about what's there and what's not there, what doesn't exist. The reality is that there's a lot of efforts happening. There's a lot of really interesting initiatives. There's a lot of artists who care, a lot of cultural organizations that are trying to do something, but they happen in isolation, and Scale rightly identified that. And the infrastructure to build a community around these like you know concern for the environmental crisis is not there. There's no central point. There's no, yeah, and there are no resources really to do it, because even though there's a huge need, it's a different type of problem in the sense that it needs new forms of collaboration. It's not concerning only the arts and culture. It's not just concerning the environmental organizations. It's everyone's problem, and the infrastructure to collaborate in this way doesn't exist yet. So that's an issue, and I think part of the challenge and the work that needs to be done is to create this infrastructure to find ways to collaborate in new ways. That's easy to say, but hard to do. However, I think the work is happening. It's just like it needs to be connected, and there needs to be a sense of community around it. Yeah.
And a sense of urgency, which is why Scale
Absolutely.
was created into 2021. And I talk a lot about Scale in this podcast because it's at the heart of the art and climate conversations. In fact, tomorrow there's a group conversation, and Scale is ongoing in its work. But it's challenged in part by the other challenges that the arts sector faces right now, including housing in large cities and all kinds of challenges from the COVID experience and the digital transformation. And so, and then you tell artists, you also have to deal with the climate emergency and this and that. But it's not, I know it shouldn't be like that, but some people perceive it that way, that it's like an extra burden. So how can we change it from being a burden to an engagement with the issues of our day, where you can really participate and be much more involved in finding, I hesitate to use the word solutions because it's too simplistic. There isn't any one solution, but there are ways, paths forward. What do you think about that?
I think, the argument that the arts are struggling with so much already to, on top of that, take on something else. I've done a lot of research for different causes, and that argument is always there. It's not unique to climate action. But I don't think that's the right way to look at it, because artists and cultural professionals are doing their work regardless. Like, they're creating culture, they're creating art, they're expressing themselves. That's happening. So the question is more like, how can my work in any way contribute to this cultural transformation that needs to happen? It's not necessarily the role of artists, cultural professionals, to take on everything, right? Funders take care of funding, artists take care of art. So how can what we already do, or what the arts and culture do, contribute to the climate emergency? And I think there's many ways to look at it, but the there definitely we need a cultural transformation, and no one's better positioned to contribute to that than the arts and culture. And so I think part of, like, the task that we have ahead is, as artists, as culture makers, is to really question how we got here in the first place. What brought us here? What are the stories we've been told about consumption, about waste, disruption of ecosystems? That this is all good because it creates economic development. To question all of that, I think is very important, because I think it's very difficult to build new worlds if we first don't understand what's wrong with the values we abide to right now. And that on the one hand, and the second is to start imagining new worlds. That is very hard for a lot of us, when you only know one way of existing and relating to other forms of life. It's very difficult to think there could be other ways. But I think arts and culture are perfectly positioned for that, to lead the way for that. Art naturally is a space where, where we can break rules, when we can create new ones, where we can question and resignify. I think we need to resignify a lot. And art needs to lead the way there, for sure. I mean, culture is always there. Culture is expression. It will always be there. So when we think about culture, especially the role of cultural organizations is to look at culture critically, and see, okay, like, what stories are we telling, and question that, and then look at perhaps new stories we can tell, new values we can commit to. So yeah.
That's very compelling, because that's what I've been hearing in bits and pieces, but you've been doing it for a while, right? So looking at that, how artists can have larger impact, what are the missing pieces in their toolkit. And sometimes it's a connection, it's a human connection, sometimes it's a bit of knowledge, sometimes it's just a bit of air, right? It's just like being listened to, valorizing an idea, connecting. You could talk to this person. I do a bit of that as well, and I find it very useful when people then, like, for instance, we do a potluck here every once a month, and people just need to talk to each other and realize that they're breaking that isolation. So I really do encourage people to do regional meetings, and to listen to people from different parts of the world who are also doing similar-ish kind of work, because we don't know until we listen. I'm a big listener, right? Until you listen to somebody's story and what they're actually going through, you don't really know. We can make assumptions. So I appreciate your telling me what you're doing individually, but I'd like to hear more about the arts and climate scene in Mexico, what you've talked a bit about what people are going through in terms of the different challenges of everyday life, water and housing and that. But what's happening in the arts community in Mexico that you would like to share with us?
Well, I mean, what I've seen here is basically that when I see the art and ecology connection, or art environment, art climate, it's not like it's happening separately. Like, this is where the arts connect to the climate, and over here, it's always very integrated. Permaculture is a big movement in Latin America, I would say, not just Mexico. It's also growing in Canada. But what I've seen is there's a lot of different experiments happening around Mexico, and then art is integrated into that. It's just part of the project. So just to give you an example here, where I spend a lot of time in Tepoztlan, there's a project called Solar, and it's a huge piece of land that was donated, and so there's agroforestry taking place there, a garden, and a farm, and then there's a school for kids. There's a body arts center. There's a photography center, and all of them work together, and it's all in the same place. Um, there's a lot of connections between art and waste or repurposing, festivals around that. Like, it takes on a very practical sort of mm, note, like, how can we just repurpose all these different materials? And I know there was a festival where basically everyone was creating out of like all these waste, in real time, just like coming up, collaborating and creating different things. But there's also, because there's a very strong tradition of craft, I've also seen a lot of there's like a movement around sustainable craft making, artisanship, and like a renewed value for artisanship as well, what it takes to make things. And so it's a very, like, I think perhaps that's unique to Mexico. I've seen it a lot with, like, fashion design, with ceramics, with architecture. There's amazing experiments going on with eco architecture, even with like culinary arts, like chefs really collaborating with local regenerative farmers. So yeah, a lot of going back to artisanship and craft. And when I talk about sustainable craft, I mean in every way, not just environmentally, but also socially, like just pay, ethical collaboration. Um, Mexico is indigenous. It's mestizo. It's a mix of Spanish and indigenous, and um, the indigenous craft has always been part of Mexican culture. Even though Mexico was colonized, the Spaniards mixed with the indigenous peoples, and so cultures were mixed, and so that indigenous part was never really erased. And it's here, but the relationship um, with that legacy, with that cultural heritage, has always been very um, sensitive, because there's racism, there's exploitation, and recently a lot of these designs had been appropriated. So what's happening now is like a renegotiation of that relationship to give like proper credit to indigenous communities for their designs, their art, and collaborating with artists and designers in a new way.
Well, I've been to Mexico a few times, and I do recall the integration of the arts with other activities in ways that are very organic, literally, permaculture and other ways, and that makes a lot of sense to me, because Western culture tends to separate things, and you have the arts, and then you have something else, and I know that the new president of Mexico is somebody who has a scientific background, and maybe that will inform decisions. It sounds good to me from a distance.
I'm very excited.
Yeah, well, we can talk some more about that in our second conversation. I want to come back to the idea of the role of the arts, because you talked about you being a connector, and some of the gaps of knowledge in that. What do you think And you can talk about the Canadian context as well at this point. What are some of the gaps, or what are the things that we can do on the short term to make it easier for artists to do the work they want to do, including climate work? What are some of the barriers, and what are some of the practical things that we could and should be doing more of?
Well, I mean, I go back to the infrastructure that's missing, which is helping build a community around it so people can connect easily, find each other. Um, One
And
of the things
Scale
I
has a tool for that, right? So that's one thing that I'll put in the episode
sure,
notes. There's a really good
yeah,
tool there for people
scale.
sorry to interrupt, but I just want to make sure that people know that there are some existing tools that we can build from. Yeah. Sorry, continue.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not aware if that's functioning already, so that's why I didn't mention it, but it's there. That's a great tool because what I what I've seen is that yes, there's lots of people doing things but separately. Also like, using this platform as well to identify what people need and what they can offer because that exchange needs to happen. The resources are there. They just need to reach those who need them. So some people might have the information you need. Some people might have the resources. I came across a lot of people who perhaps were starting, like, they had a concern, they wanted to get involved, and they just needed like that, like guidance towards where to go, like what's already out there that I can get involved with. Or I want to explore this type of practice, like, where can I find that? So, using resources like Scale to find that information. Um, but I also think, uh, I mean, because there's a huge gap in infrastructure, even though Scale is there, I do think the amount of work that has to be done to bring people together is a lot more than what is currently being done. Um, how to not like wait for that infrastructure to exist? Like, what can people do on their own? And I think self-organizing is very important. Like coming together with people, it doesn't need to be at a national level. If there's a group of people that you can connect with, just talk. You never know what will come out of it, like to exchange, share. I think that's always valuable at whatever scale, whether it's local or national. So that is really important, and I think that's where art plays a role too. That's not always talked about. I think art and making art and experiencing culture can also help shape different ways in which we come together and relate to one another. um, if you think of just participatory arts or whatever, but just, recently I attended a concert. Benjamin Finley, a colleague, also CCC alumni, was here in Mexico recently with his Desert Quill Quartet, and they were experimenting. They got together for residency. They were creating, and then they shared their work through a series of concerts. I attended one, and for example, they said, okay, well, we care about this. We're making music. How can we do something? And so they used the concert format to sort of draw people into new ways of relating to sound and connecting to their bodies, but also creating intimacy and connection space in that time they had. And these are really valuable experiments too, not just like the artistic product or the artistic like methodology, but also like how can art help us relate in new ways? And I think there's a lot to do there too. So art can bring us together, but also art itself can be helping people relate in new ways. I don't know if that
No,
I'm explaining myself.
that's good. I mean, that's what I wrote I do this newsletter called The Calm Presence, and I published one today, July 8th, called
Okay.
Realistic Planning. I just sent it out earlier today. And it's about how I'm observing a mix of denial and disempowerment in not just artists, but just people in general. They feel overwhelmed by and they're feeling the pain, but they don't know what to do, and therefore they go into a bubble of status quo because they don't seem to be other options, or they feel discouraged. And I was saying I'm not hearing much integration of conversations about climate emergency and even societal collapse, if you want to go that far, but that's very speculative. But certainly the climate emergency is right in front of us, and people aren't talking about it, including in the arts, and it puzzles me that it's not a bit more present. Like, I'll go through a whole conversation for an hour and a half and nobody will raise it. It's like it doesn't exist. And I know they know that it exists. They just don't want to talk about it because they feel that sense of sadness and pain. And I understand that. And yet, artists have created about these complex issues. They created works and procedures, and as you said, created works that invite people to share their pain and to tell their stories through participative art. And so I'm wondering, what is the secret sauce to bring, you talk about creating new infrastructure, but there is an existing infrastructure. There's art service organizations, there's networks, there's conferences. I was at a choral conference recently where there was a panel about choral music and climate, and it was really interesting, and it was a lot of discussion and questioning, and I would just like to see more of normalization, even though climate emergency is anything but normal, normalization of the existing infrastructure, so that we can take advantage of every possible meeting we have to talk about the things that we care about, and inevitably the climate, the environment, the diversity of more than human species we care about. We're just like a few steps away from bringing it into the circles of, not just the circles of power, but the circles of influence and the circles of impact. I mean, I'm ranting here a bit, Julia, but I think you know what I mean.
Oh, I know what you mean, and I'm so glad you're asking this, because one of the things I noticed, I mean, since I've been doing this work, is there's a gap between what like people care about. I know, I know, like people in arts and culture care. Um, Depending who you're like, when you ask me about resources or things they can do, inevitably like my communication lens comes in, and I think it's very different depending where you're at in your journey. If you're already involved, you might need something. If you're just starting, you so that question needs different answers. But what I can say is that the arts and culture sector cares. People care. There's a lot of things happening. Where I see the gap is not necessarily like in artists, cultural professionals, even organizations. I see it at the leadership level. This has been very shocking to me. Why is that? I I've thought about it, and I think one of the reasons could be perhaps that Canada has started experiencing the impacts of climate change more drastically in recent years, whereas other parts of the world have been experiencing that for a while. So I don't know if the what has been going on for the last few years, fires, floods, will make it more of like change the perception around it as a real emergency. I don't know. There's reluctance to speak about it as a priority, to talk about it as an emergency, to devote resources to it, and I don't know why that is. I mean, I suspect it has to do a little bit with the fact that Canada itself has a complicated relationship with the environment, with fossil fuels, and that these organizations that are well positioned to lead and guide are part of a national project too. I don't know if that's related to that, but I do know that as a sector, we need to push because that infrastructure is already there. Like there are funding bodies, there are national funding bodies, there are national arts organizations that need to take on more responsibility, and and they need pressure, I think, and collaboration too. I don't mean this in a confrontational way. I think a lot of people in these organizations are just as confused by what's going on as everyone else. This is not a problem we've faced before. This is something we need to figure out in real time. So in that sense, it's very challenging, right? To be a leader in this position. But I think one of the ways to go around it is precisely by inviting collaboration, by opening up dialogue around this, by by bringing different voices, because no one person can solve this alone. And it's very difficult, I think, for any arts organization to take this on and figure, just looking at, sector wide, like there are so many people developing their own frameworks individually. Like this is very hard, even if an arts organization could develop one framework that the entire sector could use, that would be so helpful. That's one thing. So creating unity around where to go in what direction, what matters, because um, as an artist, you can do so many things. As an organization, you can do so many things. As an individual, a member of your neighborhood, there's like so many things you can do depending where you tackle it from. But if we could just agree where as a sector we can have an impact, I think that would make a big difference. And frameworks are important for that, even though their theory and structures, like, they help. I think we need to agree as a sector where we want to put our efforts towards, for sure.
Well, tomorrow I'm publishing a episode from a panel on cultural leadership that the Public Imagination Network did in collaboration with Mass Culture. And
Yes.
it was an hour and a half. And a lot what
Yeah.
was talked about was the causes of the modernity problem, so racism, colonization. And I think that's the right thing to do, right? You got to go to the root. So
Yes.
climate emergency wasn't mentioned, but it was alluded to, right? People know that it's there. So that was a very positive meeting, though the climate emergency as such wasn't discussed. So there's like a missing link. Like you say, there's a little gap there we can fix. And there are other conversations that I'm part of and that I'm seeing where we just need to bring back a little bit of that 2019 energy, the pre-pandemic. You remember there were protests all around the world, Greta Thunberg, and there was like a growing awareness of the climate emergency. And then COVID happened, and it kind of, we all got the wind knocked out of us. And now we're coming back, and we can go even deeper from the lessons we learned from the pandemic, and pick it up again with joy, because living is joyful, right? And preserving life is joyful. And even though there's a lot of pain, the arts can kind of cut through that and do both the sort of healing part and the promise part, as well as recognizing realities and letting us sort of sit with them, the complex, difficult realities. Anyway, I'm telling you things but I'm excited that you're playing this role, and I wish we could multiply you by 1,000 or 1,000,000, because we need a lot of people like you who are sense makers and connectors, and who can build tools and make our way into a more impactful. We don't have to change the entire arts and cultural sector. We just need to sort of shift its direction a bit and help it. Not we, I mean we. When I say we, I don't mean me. I mean that the sector as a whole, as it deals with its challenges, it will benefit from, like you say, conversations, connections, collaborations within and outside the sector. Can those connections be made in ways that are local, that are real, that are, not just, promises on a page, but actual practical? And I think the arts councils and the foundations are doing good work, but they could go further in making it easier for artists to take the rightful place in those complex issues. Anyway, I'm agreeing with you, Julia. I thank you for raising those issues, and I'll continue in my own way with this podcast to talk to people and connect dots, and in both French and English. I just did a conversation this morning in French here in Ottawa with a guy named Luc Lalande, who runs an old high school, has been transformed into a community hub, and all kinds of indigenous organizations and horticultural organizations, and are all co-living in a large former high school. It's a really good example of infrastructure, literal physical infrastructure, making a difference for many communities to be able to share space and learn how to work together. And of course the arts are in there, and they're doing plays, and they're doing murals, and they're doing all kinds of beautiful things. So there is hope through the arts, because they allow us to breathe into possibility. And maybe that's the gap, is that people are losing, not feeling the hope. So the arts have always been there. I mean, historically, they've always played a role like that, but we need them more than ever, I think.
No, I agree with you. And that possibility, like being able to picture different ways, being like organizing ourselves, relating to each other is so important because it's just so difficult to picture that when all you've ever experienced is this. Um, so, when you asked about creating new conditions, I mean, and this, of course, is happening everywhere already, right? Like there are new worlds that already exist all around the world. There are pockets of experimentation. And I think the arts and culture can also help a lot there with that. And I mean the arts, ecosystem broadly speaking. Sure.
And we're just talking about permaculture. Could you expand a bit on some of your experience with that?
Sure. I mean, I think generally when people talk about permaculture, they think it's strictly about agriculture or rural setting, but the reality is that there's a set of principles, and it's growing as a movement and also like reaching urban settings, and they can be applied there. But one of the things that was very helpful to me when I took a course in a permaculture ranch here in Mexico called Las Cañadas, was like going through like the philosophy behind it and talking about like the decline that we will go through, as we transition out or run out of fossil fuels. And I found it really helpful because I find often when we talk about this decline, we think of catastrophe and doom. But what permaculture say is that we can go through this decline, and they literally draw it graphically, with dignity. And there's ways of living, there's ways of like, using resources and creating conditions that it doesn't need to be that way if we start to learn to live in a different way. So in that sense, it's an individual practice, you could say, but just this idea that we can go through that decline with dignity is really helpful to me, and how we can prepare for that, the things we need to learn, to live in a different way, to survive, if you will. I find it very helpful, and just exploring the principles of permaculture. I think it's really interesting too. Whether you are a farmer or not, it doesn't matter.
And the word culture is in there, right? So,
Absolutely, yeah, it's all about culture. I mean, it's all about culture. What's the culture we live in, and how can we change our culture to live in a different way that's not dependent on fossil fuels.
and I'm guilty myself of doomism at times because it's something you fall into, and there's a bit of dopamine that's created when you become doomist, and I'm very aware and wary of that. And so but I'm also not naive. And so when people talk about hopiness, I say, well, if it's not grounded in something real, I can't believe it. I have to really feel that this is, there are paths that are realistic and that have already happened, that it already helps, right? And when humanity is very clever, we've never been in a crisis this big, and civilizations have fallen, and then they're rebuilt, and then seeds are planted, and we're in that kind of period now where we need to seed long-term, what do you want to call it? Things that will allow for life to grow again in after this period of decline. And the decline doesn't have to be total. It can be a partial decline, and then rebuilding and regenerating, as you say.
And I think it's inevitable. The more information you have, the harder it is not to be doomist. But I think this is why we need to have more, like, focus more on cultural transformation, because that's in our hands, that's in our power, changing our culture. And it's the only way, really, like the way we live, the way we relate to each other, to the planet. So looking for, when I talk about experiments and pockets of experimentations, looking at what's already out there. And yeah, I find permaculture is a really helpful one. No, I mean, no, not really. I hope I was able to answer your questions. There's like so much information in my head, and I hope I can share it in a way that's helpful to people and to your
You
podcast.
have, and I appreciate the work that you've been doing.
Thank you, Claude.
And about courses or resources that we find, and make them available however we can. And sometimes it's word of mouth, right? It's just locally, they're friends of mine around here in Ottawa send me things, and I'm so grateful. I said, oh, what I'm needing. I love that word needing, right? Because needing is a very humble thing. Like I kind of need more knowledge. I need something, you know. And just then you give and take, and this the caring culture I think is so important, and reciprocity and giving and caring. These are things that are so important to life. Anyway, thank you so much, Julia.